The war is over, but my nightmare is just beginning as the new groom of the prince who shattered our front lines. Navigating this treacherous court requires more than just military strategy, it requires a modern wit to outsmart those seeking my head. I must survive the wedding night with a conqueror who wants my total surrender, or die trying. I remember the last thing I heard before my life stopped making any rational sense. It was Key's voice. Smooth, unhurried, a little amused at its own storytelling. The kind of voice you put on at 11:47 at night when the penthouse is finally quiet, when the last of the board decks has been closed and filed, when the midtown skyline is just decorative at that point, orange and silver behind floor-to-ceiling glass. I had my noise-canceling headphones on, my weighted blanket pulled to my chin like the most expensive piece of armor I owned. The city bum below me was 43 floors of distance and insulation, and I had earned every inch of that altitude. I am Xavier Chen, CEO of Meridian Capital Group, 34 years old, worth, well, the number changes by the hour, so let's not anchor to it. The point is, I do not panic. I do not spiral. I do not leave decisions to chance or sentiment. I am the man who restructured a failing aerospace conglomerate in 72 hours during a federal investigation, and I did it while eating a room-temperatured sandwich and answering emails. I am not, by any measurable metric, a man who should end up on a battlefield. And yet, and so the general of the Northern Yan, the most feared military mind of the age, knelt in the blood-soaked mud of the Crimson Plains as the banners of the Kalan Empire swallowed the horizon. I remember thinking, Key really knows how to set a scene. I remember the story pulling me under like warm water. I remember the episode ending on that cliffhanger. The general's fate unknown, the prince's shadow following over him. And I remember thinking I'd find out tomorrow. I did not find out tomorrow, because when I opened my eyes, I was him. Let me be precise about what I mean by that, because precision is how I stay functional when the world refuses to cooperate. I did not wake up in a white room. I did not get a tutorial. No mystical narrator was explaining the rules. One moment there was Egyptian cotton against my cheek. The next there was cold, wet mud, the smell of iron so thick it coated the back of my throat, and a weight on my torso that took me 3 full seconds to identify as armor. Battered, blood-smeared plate armor with a cracked pauldron on the left shoulder that dug into my collarbone every time I breathed. My first thought was not fear. I want to be honest about that. My first thought was an involuntary executive assessment. Inventory current assets. Identify immediate liabilities. Do not move until you understand the room. There was no room. There was a battlefield. Or rather, there was the aftermath of one, which is somehow worse, because a battlefield mid-fight has the mercy of being too loud and too fast for your brain to fully process the horror. The aftermath just sits there, patient, letting you look. I sat up slowly. Every muscle screamed. The body I was occupying had been through something catastrophic. I could feel it in the deep bone ache of a man who has been fighting for days without sleep. My hands, when I looked at them, were not my hands. They were broader. The knuckles split and re-healed and split again in that particular pattern you only get from years of weapons training. There was a deep scar that ran diagonally across the right palm, old and white and permanent. General Yan, I thought. I am General Yan Su King of the Northern Yan Confederacy, and I have just lost the war. I sat with that for a moment, not because I was panicking, I wasn't, but because even in my world, even in the marble and glass world of Meridian Capital, I had learned that the most dangerous thing you can do when you find yourself on a hostile playing field is pretend you understand it before you actually do. I had seen executives blow up entire acquisition deals that way, walking into a room thinking they owned it when they hadn't even read the room's history. So, I read. The sky above me was the color of a bruise, deep purple and sick yellow at the edges, the sun somewhere behind a wall of smoke that hadn't fully cleared. Around me, bodies, hundreds, both sides identifiable by the banners that still clung to fallen poles. The dark blue crane of the Northern Yan on one side, the silver and crimson dragon of the Kalan Empire on the other. The ratio was not in my favor. I counted roughly 3 Yan for every 2 Kalan, which tracked with what the story had said, a Pyrrhic victory for neither side, but a strategic collapse for the North. Market analysis, some part of my brain said, almost hysterically. You are doing market analysis on a massacre. Yes, I was, because that was the only way I was going to survive the next 5 minutes. I was trying to stand, cataloging my injuries as I went, the rib that was definitely cracked, the shallow laceration on my left forearm that had been clumsily bandaged at some point, when I heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, many, coming from the south, from the direction of the Kalen encampment, and coming at a measured pace that told me this was not a charge. This was a procession. I had exactly enough time to get to one knee before they crested the ridge. He was at the center. Of course he was. You always put the principal in the center, flanked and protected, visible and elevated. It's basic power staging, and whoever had designed Prince Kalen's military pageantry understood it intuitively. He rode a horse so black it looked like a wound in the landscape, a massive Fergana breed that held its head with the arrogance of an animal that has never been afraid of anything. The prince himself wore armor that was functional but deliberate, no decorative excess, just clean, dark plates and a half-cape of deep crimson that moved with the wind like it was enjoying itself. He was young. That was my first surprise. In the story, Kay had described him as ruthless and brilliant, and my brain had defaulted to conjuring someone older, harder-lined, world-weary. But Prince Kalen could not have been more than 28, maybe 29, with a face that would have been arrestingly handsome under different circumstances, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, dark eyes that caught the sick light and held it. Those eyes found me immediately. I want to tell you that I felt nothing, but I'd be lying about the quality of that gaze. It wasn't predatory exactly. It was assessing, measuring, the way I look at a balance sheet for the first time, calm and focused, and decide something before I've said a single word. He stopped his horse 3 meters from me. His inner circle fanned out behind him. I did not look at them yet. Peripheral intel could wait. Right now, the principal demanded full attention. "General Yan Su King," he said. His voice was even, not theatrical. Generals who have just won decisive battles sometimes get theatrical about it. He didn't. "I expected to find your corpse." My ribs screamed as I straightened my spine. I kept my face like stone. "Apologies for the inconvenience," I said. A beat of silence. One of his officers made a sound, half laugh, half alarm. The prince's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. An adjustment, a recalibration. Good, I thought. Uncertainty is leverage. Never let them predict you. "You have 2 options," he said, as if I hadn't spoken. "Execution here, as the spoils of war demand, or—" He paused, not for drama. He was watching me very carefully. "You come with me." "As a prisoner," I said. It wasn't a question. "As mine," he said. And that word, mine, landed with a weight that I stored immediately at the back of my mind, tagged and categorized, to be analyzed later when I wasn't bleeding on a battlefield. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my options with the speed of someone who has run 3 hostile acquisitions simultaneously. Option A, refusal, execution, story ends. Option B, compliance, survival, story continues. Option C, was there an option C? There was not. Not yet. "Then I suppose," I said, very carefully, "that I accept your terms, Your Highness." He studied me the way you study something that doesn't quite fit the box you prepared for it. Then he turned his horse, and the procession began to move. I was alive, barely, and in the custody of the most dangerous man in the empire. Risk assessment complete, I thought. As a soldier, none too gently hauled me to my feet. Current survival probability? Low. Improving? Workable. They told me on the 3rd day. I had spent the first 2 days doing what any intelligent operative does when dropped into an unfamiliar organization. I observed everything and said as little as possible. They had given me a tent on the perimeter of the Kalen encampment, a guard outside, and surprisingly adequate medical attention. The last detail was interesting. You don't waste your field physician on a man you plan to execute. That told me something about the prince's intentions that his face had not yet confirmed. I memorized the camp's layout by watching the patterns of movement through the tent's gap. I cataloged the internal hierarchies by watching who deferred to whom at mealtimes. I built in my head what I could only describe as an org chart of the Kalen military structure, and I identified 3 individuals who seemed to have the prince's direct confidence. His second-in-command, Commander Dressed, a broad, graying man in his late 40s who moved like a man who has survived by being unmovable. A younger aide whose deference to the prince had an anxious, watchful quality that suggested ambition beneath the loyalty. And a woman, I nearly missed her because she wore administrative robes rather than armor, who stood at the prince's left side during what appeared to be strategy discussions and whose stillness felt deliberate rather than passive. These were my key stakeholders. I tagged them accordingly. On the morning of the 3rd day, Commander Dressed came to my tent himself. That was a signal too senior for routine prisoner management. He had the decency to sit before he delivered the news, which I appreciated. His Imperial Highness Prince Kalen of the Crimson Throne, he said with the practiced formality of someone reciting a legal document, has informed the Council of Rights that he intends to formalize his claim over the Northern Yan territories through a union of bodies and blood, a political marriage, as is customary in imperial annexation. I looked at him. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The general, that is, you, have been named as the contracted party. The silence that followed was long. Inside that silence, I ran the numbers with a speed that would have frightened anyone who could see my internal dashboard. Political marriage. Me. To the prince. The purpose, to symbolically absorb the Northern Yan leadership into the Kalen imperial structure. To humiliate the defeated nation through its greatest general. To make it impossible for any Yan loyalist faction to claim the North has not been utterly and completely subjugated. I thought about the original Yan, the man whose body I now occupied, whose life I had stepped into like a suit that didn't quite fit. He had been proud, brilliant, devoted to his nation with the kind of bone-deep loyalty that drives people to impossible things. What would he have done with this news? He would have rejected it and chosen death. I was not him. Think, I told myself. Stop feeling and think. What is the strategic value of this position? A general who becomes the prince's consort doesn't disappear. They become embedded in the power structure. They gain access, intelligence, leverage. You are not surrendering. You are executing a long-term infiltration strategy. The fact that the prince was extraordinarily attractive was completely irrelevant, and I was not going to think about it. I understand, I told Commander Dressed. His eyebrows went up. You have 3, I said. Minor ones, reasonable ones. I would like to present them to His Highness directly. Dressed stared at me for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about this situation. Then, slowly, he stood up. I'll pass the message, he said. The meeting with the prince was that evening. They dressed me for it, or rather someone brought clean clothes and left them without explanation, which I interpreted as the prince's way of making a statement about standards. The robes were Kalen style, deep blue with silver edging, cinched at the waist with a wide sash. I had never worn anything like it, and I spent an embarrassing 2 minutes trying to figure out the layering sequence before a serving boy materialized from nowhere and fixed it without making eye contact. The tent they led me to was the prince's private command quarters, larger than the others, appointed with campaign furniture that managed to be both functional and aesthetically deliberate. Maps on every surface, a brazier that threw warm amber light, and Prince Kalen seated at the center table as if the tent had been designed specifically to frame him. He had changed out of his armor. In its place, a simpler robe, dark as his horse, open at the collar in a way that was either casual or calculated. Probably both. He looked up when I entered and said nothing, just watched me walk to the table and settle across from him without waiting to be invited to sit. His eyes narrowed fractionally. I filed that away. "Your conditions," he said. 3, I confirmed. "First, my officers and remaining soldiers are not to be executed. They will be integrated into your labor corps if you require, or released to the Northern Territories, not executed." He was silent. "Second," I continued, "the civilians of the Yan capital are not to be subjected to retribution raids during the transition period. They had no say in the war's prosecution." Another silence, longer this time. He was watching me the way I'd watch the battlefield, measuring the distance between what he expected and what he was getting. "And the third?" I looked at him directly. "That you don't mistake my compliance for defeat." The tent was very quiet. Then, slowly, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. An involuntary thing, which told me it was genuine. Granted, all 3. I maintained my composure through what I can only describe as significant internal turbulence. I had half expected refusal on at least one point, a negotiation, some friction that I could use to read his priorities more clearly. Instead, he had simply agreed, without leverage, which meant either he had already intended to grant those things and I had merely given him a convenient frame for it, or he was testing my response to unexpected generosity. I was going to need to watch this man very, very carefully. "There is one condition of mine as well," he said, just as I was processing my minor victory. "Of course," I said. "You will not lie to me." His voice was flat and certain. "On anything of substance, I have no patience for it." I held his gaze. Interesting demand. Most people in power demand loyalty, obedience, performance of devotion. He's asking for honesty. Either he genuinely values it, or he's the kind of strategist who prefers enemies he can see clearly. Either way, noted. "I can agree to that," I said carefully, "provided you understand that honesty and full disclosure are not the same thing." That ghost smile again, more visible this time. "Agreed," he said. I stood, inclined my head in what I hoped was an appropriate gesture of formal acknowledgement, and turned to leave. I made it 3 steps before he spoke again. "General Yan." His voice hadn't changed, measured, even, but something in it made me stop. I looked back at him over my shoulder. I'll take that as a compliment. It was an observation, for now. I walked back to my tent, sat down on the sleeping pallet, pressed the heels of my palms against my eyes, and allowed myself exactly 90 seconds of quiet internal screaming before I put my CEO face back on and began to plan. The imperial capital of Kalen arrived like a physical argument. I had expected grandeur. The story had described it lavishly, all pale stone and crimson towers and gates so massive they apparently required 600 men to open. But Kay's voice in my headphones had, I now realized, been doing the place a disservice. The reality was not so much beautiful as intentional. Every street angle, every gate proportion, every tower height had been designed to make you feel small, to make you feel that you were entering something so much larger than yourself that resistance was not only futile, but philosophically absurd. Brilliant architecture, I thought, walking behind the prince's guard through the outer courtyard for the first time. Total environmental psychological domination. Whoever designed this had read Intimidation 101 and wrote the next 3 chapters. I had approximately 2 weeks before the wedding ceremony. 2 weeks to build a working map of every major power player in this court. 2 weeks to identify who wanted me dead, who was indifferent, and, crucially, whether anyone might be leveraged into an unlikely alliance. I began with what I knew from the story, which was admittedly fragmentary. Kale's episode had ended before most of the court politics had played out, but I had a baseline. I ran the court like a competitive landscape analysis. The Empress Dowager, the prince's mother, still living, influential, deeply unhappy about this marriage. She had other candidates, daughters of allied noble houses, women of appropriate lineage and breeding. A captured general of a defeated nation was an insult dressed as a trophy. I tagged her hostile, high influence, must neutralize or avoid activating. Lord Councillor Marin, the prince's primary political advisor and the most powerful man in court after Kaelin himself, old guard, conservative, had built his influence over 20 years of careful positioning and would perceive a new consort as a potential vector of disruption. I tagged him hostile, dangerous, sophisticated. Do not underestimate. Lady Shen, the administrative aide I had noticed at camp, closer study revealed she was not an aide at all, but the prince's unofficial spy master, embedded in the administrative corps as cover. Neutral, possibly friendly, reads people for a living, will see through most standard performances, approach with genuine cards, not a full hand. The younger, ambitious officer, Captain Ruo, had a more complex profile. He was loyal to the prince to an almost performative degree, which suggested he was managing something beneath the surface, likely an overcorrection for some past failure or an attempt to stay close enough to power to eventually redirect it. I tagged him volatile, ignore for now, monitor. My chambers were beautiful, which I would have appreciated more if I hadn't identified 3 potential ingress points and one very suspicious decorative pillar that had been deliberately placed at an angle providing concealment for anyone standing behind it. On day 2 of my residence, I rearranged the furniture on the pretense of aesthetic preference, which resolved the pillar problem. The serving staff found this eccentric. I chose not to explain. The first attempt on my life came 8 days before the wedding. It was, frankly, underwhelming. A slow-acting compound in my evening tea, not enough to kill, almost certainly intended to incapacitate. The incompetence of it told me more than the attempt itself. Whoever had ordered it was working with resources they didn't fully trust, which suggested either internal factional friction or a principal who was cautious enough to want deniability on the first attempt. Probably not Marin. He was too competent for this clumsy an approach. More likely someone acting on the Empress Dowager's behalf without full authorization. I poured the tea into a potted ornamental tree, which began to lose leaves within 48 hours. I kept this information. On the 10th day, Kaelin summoned me for what his steward formally described as a cultural briefing. I had been navigating the etiquette of the Kaelin court with the focused terror of a man who has spent his entire adult life in a different social operating system, and who is now running legacy code on incompatible hardware. The bowing protocols alone nearly broke me in the first week. Who bows first? How deep? What the angle of the hands means? Why the left foot forward versus the right foot forward signals 2 completely different things. I watched every person I encountered with the desperate attention of a language student in a country where a mispronunciation could end in diplomatic incident. I had made one significant error on day 4, during a formal dinner where I had addressed the prince directly before being addressed, which was apparently a significant breach of protocol. The table had gone very still. I had recovered by treating it as an intentional mark of military presumption. The old soldier's habit is speaking before thinking, Your Highness, a flaw I am working to correct, which transformed the gaffe into a characterful eccentricity. 3 courtiers had found this charming. Lord Councillor Marin had not. The cultural briefing was a test. Kaelin knew it, I knew it, and he probably knew I knew it. He sat across from me, and his chamberlain walked me through 12 specific ceremonial obligations of the consort role. I listened with all of myself, asking occasional clarifying questions that were just intelligent enough to demonstrate comprehension without revealing that I was learning everything from scratch. At one point, the chamberlain described a ritual involving a specific form of ceremonial prostration that would be required during the wedding itself. I felt every muscle in my body resist the concept reflexively. Xavier Chen does not prostrate himself. Xavier Chen has never once in his adult life bowed lower than a polite professional nod. I kept my face like stone. Understood, I said. Kaelin was watching me. He had been watching me throughout with that particular quality of attention. Not suspicious exactly, fascinated in the way a researcher is fascinated by an anomaly that keeps refusing to conform to the expected data. When the chamberlain left, we sat in silence for a moment. You despise this, Kaelin said. I respect the necessity of ritual, I answered. That is not an answer. I looked at him. He looked back. We had developed over the past 10 days a kind of conversational shorthand, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us was particularly interested in the performance that protocol demanded, and that within the boundaries of private audience, something closer to directness was permissible. Some aspects of the ceremony, I said carefully, are not native to my personal disposition. The prostration, he said, among others. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it's not a punishment, it's a signal to the court that you have chosen this, that you are not here under compulsion. I understand that, I said. And yet you haven't tried to kill me. I looked at him. The week isn't over. That startled a genuine sound out of him. Not quite a laugh, something shorter and more surprised. He caught it quickly, smoothed it back into composure, but it was there. It had been real. And I felt something shift in the air between us that I was absolutely not ready to analyze, so I filed it under pending review and moved on. Strategic display of vulnerability, check, the CEO part of me noted. Pique the obsession, noted. The part of me that was not the CEO noted something else. The quality of the smile that had escaped him. The way it had reached his eyes before he recalled it. But I locked that data point behind a door marked irrelevant and turned the key. 5 days before the wedding, someone tried to kill us both. We were riding, the prince had insisted on an inspection of the northern city wall, a routine security matter that I had been included in largely, I suspected, as an exercise in public optics. The consort-to-be, visible and present, not hiding in chambers, a statement of confidence. I had dressed for it appropriately and was managing the unfamiliar saddle with the grim focus of a man who has not ridden a horse since he was 12 years old at a summer camp in Connecticut and is now attempting to fake competence on a Fergana warhorse in front of 200 court soldiers. The arrows came from the granary tower to the northeast, 3 of them in rapid succession, not from the same position, which told me immediately that this was a coordinated multi-point attack rather than a single archer acting alone. A solo assassin goes for maximum impact from the best vantage point. 3 different positions means a team. A team means organization, funding, prior scouting of the route. This is a board-level decision, my brain said crisply, even as my horse was rearing and I was wrestling the reins with every muscle I had. This isn't a faction operative. Someone with significant resources may this call. Kaelin's guard was excellent. They had already formed a shield around the prince before the second arrow cleared the tower. But the third arrow clipped one of the guard horses, causing a chaos of falling men and screaming animals that scattered the formation. And in that scatter, I saw it. 2 men on foot, moving through the crowd panic, heading toward the prince's exposed right flank. Not soldiers. Their movement pattern was wrong, too practiced in civilian concealment. Assassins. The arrows had been the distraction. I made a decision in approximately half a second. I drove my horse forward and to the right, not because I am heroic, I want to be very clear about this, but because the vectors were the only option that made tactical sense, and I have never in my life been able to tolerate a situation with an obvious correct move that nobody is taking. I put my horse between the 2 men in the prince's flank and shouted in my best approximation of a military command voice, deeper and more authoritative than anything Xavier Chen had ever needed to produce in a boardroom. "North flank, close it!" 3 soldiers responded to my voice before they even looked for the threat. Military conditioning is remarkable that way. The men were apprehended within seconds. The prince had watched all of it from the center of the suddenly reformed guard ring, his expression unreadable. Afterward, the arrests made, the scene controlled, everyone relocated to a secure compound, Kaelin and I were alone for the first time since the incident. His chamberlain and Commander Drest were outside, coordinating the interrogation. The room was quiet. "The granary tower," I said, because the silence was going to sit there regardless and I might as well do something with it. "Someone scouted your inspection route in advance. The arrows weren't meant to kill. The angle was wrong for a genuine attempt on a moving target from that distance. They were for scatter and distraction. The real move was the foot approach." Kaelin was looking at me in that way again, the recalibrating way. "You analyzed the attack parameters in real time," he said. It wasn't a question. "Threat assessment is an automatic function for me," I said, which was true in ways he couldn't fully understand. The scout who logged this route did so within the last 48 hours. The civilian foot traffic near the northern market suggests a new presence. You have a leak somewhere in your inspection scheduling office. Probably not a senior person. Senior operatives know better than to surveil personally. Someone mid-level with access. He was very still. I have 3 candidates, I continued, because I've been sitting on this for 2 days and there was apparently no time like the present. Your second logistics coordinator who has had 3 unexplained absences in the past month, the apprentice cartographer who was assigned the Northern Wall survey last week and whose work I reviewed. The survey has deliberate errors in it, small ones, the kind you make when you're copying a version you were given rather than walking the route yourself. And a tea house owner near the East Gate who receives deliveries from a merchant family that has documented ties to the Empress Dowager's household accounts. Silence. Kalen set down the cup he had been holding, very carefully. "How long have you known this?" he said. The cartographer, day 3, the tea house owner, day 7, the logistics coordinator, yesterday. And you said nothing. I was still verifying, I said, and I wasn't certain whether the information would be welcomed or whether it would be perceived as overreach. I looked at him directly. I'm still not certain, but today seems like the wrong time for that particular caution. He stood up. He walked to the window. They had the narrow fortress-style windows of a military residence, letting in gray light in precise columns, and he stood there for a long moment with his back to me. I watched the tension in his shoulders and waited. "You have been running intelligence operations inside my court," he said. "I have been observing," I said. "Observing and categorizing. It's what I do. I can't turn it off." "What else do you know?" Full disclosure versus honesty. This was the moment the distinction mattered. Enough to be more useful to you alive than dead, and enough to make certain I intend to stay alive. He turned from the window. The gray light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, and I could not read his expression, which was deeply inconvenient. "You are the most unusual person I have ever encountered," he said. "I get that occasionally," I said. This time the sound that escaped him was unmistakably a laugh, brief and sudden and real, and it did something to the architecture of the room that I was not prepared for. It made the room smaller. It made him less like an empire and more like a person. I looked away first, which was a strategic error, and I knew it, but I made it anyway. That night, alone in my chambers, I sat by the window for a long time. The city outside was quieter than New York. Even the capitals of ancient empires apparently went to sleep at some point, unlike a city that seems constitutionally opposed to the concept. Above me, stars I didn't know the names of. Below me, lanterns moving through dark streets. I thought about my apartment, the midtown skyline, the weight of my headphones, Key's voice. I thought about whether anyone had noticed I was gone, whether my board was managing without me, whether anyone had checked on my penthouse in the 43 days, it had been 43 days now by my count, since I had simply ceased to exist. I thought about Kalen, which I had specifically decided I was not going to do. Protective pull, I noted to myself, with the clinical distance of a man reading his own lab results. Developing. Monitor closely. Do not act on. The city's lanterns moved slowly below me like a slow-motion constellation. I had spent 34 years building a life that was successful and ordered and mine, and it had fit me like a well-tailored suit. I had never needed anyone to stand beside me. I had never wanted what the neediness of needing implied. But I was also sitting in an ancient city 43 days from home, and the only person in this entire empire who had spoken to me as if I were a full human being, as if my mind were something valuable rather than threatening, was a man who had conquered everything he had ever touched, and who had not yet tried to conquer me. I was not sure what to do with that, so I filed it, carefully, in a folder I labeled with a word I didn't examine too closely. The wedding day arrived the way all truly significant events arrive, without fanfare, wearing the ordinary face of a morning. I woke at first light, as I always did now. The yon body's rhythms had trained themselves to battlefield hours, and I had stopped fighting it. I sat at the edge of the sleeping platform and performed what had become my daily operational review. Known threats, current status of each, probability assessments, contingency plans. The tea house spy had been identified and quietly removed by Lady Shen 3 days ago. The logistics coordinator had been reassigned to a position with no scheduling access. The cartographer remained in place, watched but not touched. A known variable being managed was more useful than an eliminated one who would simply be replaced by an unknown one. I had suggested this to Kalen through an intermediary, and he had implemented it without comment, which I was now interpreting as a form of approval. Lord Councillor Marin was the outstanding concern. He was too smart to have ordered something as clumsy as the poison tea, and too influential to be behind the arrow attack. That had the Empress Dowager's fingerprints on every surface. But Marin had been quiet for 4 days in a way that felt like the quiet of a man building rather than a man conceding. I had observed him at the 3 formal events preceding the wedding, and each time he had been watching me with an expression I could only describe as professional evaluation, not hostility, assessment. He was deciding, I thought, whether I was an asset or a liability. I needed him to decide the former, but I hadn't yet determined how. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for midday in the Grand Ceremonial Hall, the largest formal space in the capital, designed for exactly this kind of imperial pageantry. I was dressed by 6 attendants in a process that took 2 hours and involved more layers than any reasonable garment should contain. The robes were extraordinary, deep blue and silver, the yan colors deliberately integrated into the Kalen ceremonial style, a symbolic integration that had been, I was told, the prince's specific instruction. I thought about that while the final ceremonial sash was tied. I was escorted to the antechamber of the hall at the 11th hour. The ceremony would begin when the drums sounded. I stood alone in the antechamber. The attendants had been dismissed, a traditional pre-ceremony moment of solitary reflection, and I did, in fact, reflect. I had been in this world for 51 days. I had survived 2 assassination attempts, 1 poisoning attempt, navigated one of the most politically complex courts I had ever encountered in any context, conducted intelligence operations under cover of social adaptation, and, incidentally, fallen into a pattern of private conversations with an ancient imperial conqueror that had become, over time, the part of each day I found myself anticipating most. Irrelevant, I told myself, for the last time. Then I stopped lying to myself, finally, in that quiet antechamber, and acknowledged what was in the folder I hadn't labeled. The drums sounded. I walked into the grand ceremonial hall, and the first thing I saw at the far end of the aisle was Kalen. He was dressed in deep crimson and gold, his formal regalia precise and severe, his bearing completely still. Around him, hundreds of the Empire's most powerful people. Above us, a ceiling that could have housed a small city. The weight of the moment was enormous. Ritual, politics, history, the eyes of an entire conquered nation's legacy pressing down on every step I took. He watched me walk toward him. I kept my face like stone, my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought the sound might echo. Halfway down the aisle, I saw it. Lord Councillor Marin, standing in his designated position of honor, 3rd to the left of the throne dais. His eyes were not on me. They were on the man standing behind the ceremonial incense pillar to my right. A figure, to casual observation, appeared to be a court attendant. But his positioning was wrong. His stillness was the stillness of someone waiting for a specific signal, not the passive stillness of ceremony. And beneath his attendant's robes, at the edge of something that caught the light wrong, a blade. Here it is, I thought, the final move. Marin was not an enemy, he was an operator. He had assessed me over these weeks and had not, ultimately, concluded I was a liability. He had concluded that someone else had concluded I was a liability, and he was here to be present when that conclusion was acted upon. Not the principal, the witness. The political successor to a political vacuum, he intended to position himself inside. The blade was not for me. I understood this with complete certainty when I tracked the sightline from the attendant's position to the throne dais and realized it terminated not at the aisle, but at the dais itself. They were here for Kalen. The ceremony demanded that I approach the dais and kneel, the formal prostration, the moment of maximum symbolic vulnerability, when every eye in the room would be on the act of submission, and the prince, receiving it, would be at his most ceremonially exposed. I had approximately 30 seconds. I reached the dais. I looked up at Kalen. He was watching me with that expression I now knew, the fascinated, measuring look that had evolved over 51 days into something warmer and less guarded. I did not kneel. I turned. The sound that rippled through the hall, the collective intake of breath at the breach of ceremony, was my signal. Every eye in the room moved to me, and in the momentary disruption of the hall's collective attention, I crossed the 6 steps between myself and the pillar at the speed of a man who has, in his other life, never done anything physically remarkable, but whose body was trained to military reflex. I caught the attendant's wrist before he cleared the blade. The struggle was brief. The security response was immediate, triggered by my action, and within seconds, the false attendant was on the ground and surrounded. I stood, straightened, and turned back to the hall. Complete silence. 400 of the most powerful people in the Kalen Empire staring at the general of the defeated Northern Yan standing in their grand ceremonial hall with blood on their ceremonial robes, having just prevented the assassination of their prince. I looked at Lord Councillor Marin. He looked back at me. And slowly, with the precise calculation of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why, he inclined his head. There it is, I thought. You were testing whether I was worth backing. Now you know. I turned back to the dais. Kalen was standing. He had not moved from his position, either because his training had held him in place, or because he had recognized what was happening before I acted and trusted the outcome. Knowing him, probably both. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he descended the 3 steps of the dais and walked to where I stood, which was not the protocol, which was in fact a radical departure from every procedural expectation of this ceremony, and which was causing a secondary wave of hall-wide astonishment that I filed away as useful political capital for later. He stopped in front of me, eye to eye, close enough that I could see the particular quality of focus in his gaze that I had spent 51 days learning to read. "You didn't kneel," he said, very quietly. "You prefer honesty to performance," I said, just as quietly. Kneeling was a performance. This was honest. A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at my hands, the right one where the struggle had left a mark. He reached out and took it, and I did not pull back. His grip was careful, precise, the touch of someone who is choosing exactly how much pressure to apply. "You owe me my life," he said. "You owe me a conversation. Several, actually, about the court, about the investigation, about the security protocols for your scheduling office, which are frankly inadequate. But also," I stopped. I looked at him and I let something show in my face that I had not let show in 51 days. Also, about what comes after this. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he laced his fingers through mine, still careful, still precise, still exactly as much pressure as was chosen, and turned back toward the dais. "Come," he said. "We have a ceremony to finish." We finished it together. There was no prostration. There was a modification to the rite that the court ritualist, showing remarkable improvisational skill or the political instincts of a man who wants to survive his career, reframed as a dual standing declaration of binding, unprecedented in imperial history, as half the court would tell the other half for the next 3 days. A new form for a new arrangement. We stood on the dais as the final declarations were read. I was aware of every person in that hall reading the moment, filing it, calculating it, adjusting their positioning accordingly. Marin, already adjusted. Lady Shen, with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Commander Drest, looking like a man who has accepted that the world will continue to surprise him and has decided this is acceptable. Kalen's hand, still in mine, was very warm. I thought about my penthouse, the quiet of it, the skyline. Key's voice pulling me into a story I could not have written for myself in 100 years of strategic planning. I thought, I am standing in an ancient imperial capital, having just outmaneuvered a court assassination and married a prince I was introduced to over my body's literal corpse on a battlefield, and I was what? functional, alive, positioned, strategic. Also, not ready to leave. Not ready in a way that was very specific and very clear and had nothing to do with survival probability calculations. Protective pull. The label in the folder read, "Developing." I looked at the profile of the man beside me. The sharp jaw. The stillness that I now knew was not coldness, but the particular discipline of someone who has never permitted himself to trust lightly and is trying, very carefully, to do so now. Developed. I corrected the label. Irreversible. The ceremony concluded to the sound of drums and the stamping of ceremonial spears, and the grand hall of the Kalan Empire acknowledged its new imperial pair with the formality of 1,000 years of ritual. And if the court noticed that the general's hand remained in the prince's throughout the recession, and that neither of them showed any inclination to release it, well, let them notice. I have never, I thought, in the particular wry internal voice of a man who has accepted the absurdity of his own life, been conventional. Later, much later, the formal banquet, the endless formal conversations, the political navigation of a post-ceremony court reception that I had prepared for like a Q4 earnings call and survived through a combination of preparation, improvisation, and the discovery that Kalan, positioned at my side, had a dry and extremely precise sense of humor that he deployed only for my benefit, in a murmur so quiet it was invisible to the room. I had noted, cataloged, and was choosing to fully enjoy this. When the last guest had departed and the last lamp had been carried away, and the vast reception hall stood empty around us, we were alone together for the first time as whatever we now were. The silence had a different quality than earlier silences, not adversarial, not cautious, simply present. "Tell me something true," Kalan said. He had said this to me once before, weeks ago, as a kind of test. Now it felt like something else. I thought about it seriously. "I am not from here," I said. "Not from this world, and not from this time, and not from this body, not originally. I know that is impossible to explain and possibly impossible to believe, and I have not said it before because the strategic risk of it being perceived as madness was too high. But you asked for something true, and that is the most fundamental true thing I have." He was quiet for a long moment. "That explains," he said finally, "a great deal. You're not going to ask me to elaborate. You'll tell me when you want to," he said. "I'm in no hurry." I looked at him. He looked back. Somewhere in the city below the palace walls, a lamp was still moving through the dark. "I've been taking notes on your court, organizational restructuring recommendations, security overhaul priorities. I have ideas about the Northern Yan integration that would reduce resistance significantly and improve economic yield within 3 years. I also have opinions about your grain taxation model that I will keep to myself unless invited." "Consider yourself invited," he said. "That might take a while." "We have time," he said. And there was something in those 3 words, the quiet certainty of them, the absence of any hedging or performance, that landed somewhere between my ribs and stayed there. "Yes," I said, "we do." I was Xavier Chen, CEO of Meridian Capital Group, currently occupying the body of General Yan Su King of the conquered North, in a world built from ancient war and political fire and the particular storytelling voice of a YouTuber I listened to at night when New York was too loud. I had survived the hostile takeover. I had secured the board. I had, against every rational projection in my internal risk model, stood at the edge of something I had not planned for and chosen not to step back from it. My heart hammered against my ribs the way it only did in the moments before a decision that could change everything. I let it. "K," I thought, in the direction of a city I might never see again. "You didn't warn me about the ending." But then, maybe that was the point. The end.